Okay, this is such a great panel. So let's have some questions. We've already got two. Let's try and get in as three. It's like in a bingo. Who's got four? Okay, go ahead, please, and give us your name and affiliation.
Hi, good morning. Maria Dreyfus with Miami-Dade County. We heard at the beginning the situation in Venezuela with the opposition, and I would like to, I heard from the three panelists the situation and the difficulty, but I would like to hear also what would be your recommendations for the opposition. What would they do? What would
Stay together. That's a big one.
Maintain unity to start with.
I think number one, certainly unity. They have been very, very deeply divided, and even in the process that leading up to this, there was extraordinary internal squabbling. And I think it's even important to note that somebody whom I know personally and fairly well, Leopoldo, one of the reasons I think for his prolonged first his jailing and then his prolonged stay in jail is in large measure because certain sectors of the opposition were frankly glad to have him out of the way for a while. And so I think that's important. I think the opposition now, however, has to rally around the liberation of Leopoldo and the rest of the political prisoners. And for that, I think not a recommendation for the opposition, but certainly for President Maduro. I think President Maduro needs right now to look magnanimous. Yeah. And needs to do so, and largely because even UNASUR, whom everybody thought was going to have this terrible behavior there, and the reality is that UNASUR's number one recommendation leaving is diálogo nacional, a national dialogue. I think Maduro will have to engage in that dialogue, but as Bruce said a while ago, the real issue is whether the opposition can maintain its unity in the context of going forward, and especially in terms of let us assume that Leopoldo comes out of jail. You remember as a Venezuelan that jail appears to be a necessary first step to the presidency. All right, so I think we need to keep that in mind, that when Leopoldo is, and I hope he is soon, when he comes out, he's already a contender for the presidency. Yeah, absolutely. And so that is going to really be a very, very significant for the opposition to stay together.
Okay, we have lots of questions. Let's try and get them all in, right in the center table.
Yes, hello, Jessica Cascante from the Mexican Consulate in Miami. And I would like to know, how do we pair this optimistic forecast that we heard in the economic table earlier, with this tough scenario that we are listening now in the political arena, especially for countries like Mexico and Argentina, regarding corruption and organized crime? Thanks.
I just said to Ian, that's a good question. Actually, the ability to make money does not require good government, unfortunately, in many cases. So that's how you pair it. I mean, they were talking basically about where the opportunities for profit are, where there are good investments, et cetera, et cetera. At a certain point, if a government becomes totally dysfunctional, then there are, you do have to sort of factor that in a little more, and it might be quite discouraging. So that's how I would pair it. And I do think that both the pessimism to a certain extent about the strength of political institutions and the optimism about, being able to make money in Mexico go together, except at the extreme of disintegration of the politics and, or total violence or something like that.
Can I just add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
What's fascinating about Mexico right now, and I work a lot on public opinion, and I've been following public opinion in Mexico very, very well. But what really is very surprising in Mexico, and you almost see a kind of a parallel thing here. As soon as the PRI undergoes all of these accusations of corruption, what you have right now in Mexico is an incredible amount of people who call themselves independents. All right. And so the membership in the PRI, or at least people who call themselves PRIistas, is going down extremely. And so what concerns me more about Mexico than anything else is that if you see that very similar movement elsewhere in the region, it has led, in fact, to the emergence of the Evos and the, you know, and the Hugos and others like that. And then when you look at that very same data, and you combine, for example, the three so-called populists, right? Are the most recent, what is his name? El Matador, what is his name?
Bronco.
El Bronco, pardon me, El Matador. Yeah,
Trump.
Bronco. When you look at Bronco, when you look at Mancera in Mexico City from the PRD, and you look at AMLO, together, all right, they represent, they're dominating the you know, the projections for voter intention in the long run, and the PRI is going to have a very difficult time winning. So I think, you know, is Mexico headed toward a populist? At least it's headed, I think, in terms of a very, very severe questioning of its political system.
Okay. David, and then John, and then Irene, and we have another question. Oh, you actually have the microphone.
have
Go
the
go
control.
for it. And then pass it over to David, please.
Yes, Veronica Lopez here from the Venezuelan table.
Great.
Which, you know, remains
There's another.
optimistic.
You have competition over here.
Yeah, but we are very cautious, and there are two questions, maybe thought-provoking. Susan, what would have happened had, you know, Sunday night, the government would have gotten the Army's support? So the question is here, what if it could still happen? What if, I understand that the next promotion of generals were all schoolmates or classmates with Diosdado. So who would help? What would be the position of the U.S.? What would the region do if that scenario, which would turn to be a nightmare, would happen? Dr. Bagley, before I close, just to provoke you too, what if the politicians get together and they approve of the impeachment and your thesis is contested? Where's Lula? Is there a shadow? Is anybody going to say something about Lula? I rest my case.
Are you going to take a bunch?
Go ahead. No, that's fine.
Oh, okay.
We could do that. We could do that. But it's my panel, though, Susan, and you're on your way out. So we're going to take that question. It's a good one. Go ahead.
No, I think that in a very basic way, it would all depend on who went into the streets. And if this time, you know, if they had not allowed for these results, if there's ever been a chance for people to take to the streets in broader kinds of numbers and groups, it was now. There's also a slight change, actually, with Macri's election, because he seems to be willing to go out more on a limb, you know, in favor of democracy. And Almagro, to my surprise, who everyone said, oh, he's a leftist head of the OAS and stuff. Now, words are not actions, but there is a slight change, I think, and maybe Macri will end up leading a much more critical role, criticism of abuses, blatant abuses of power and things. But if you're thinking of the United States, forget it. And everybody else is otherwise engaged in trying to keep their own countries afloat.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments. With regard to the Venezuelan question, I couldn't agree more with my colleagues here on the panel, but I think a second thing that the opposition has to keep in mind is that change is going to have to come incrementally. It cannot come from de la noche a la mañana, and if they try to overreach, they are going to produce significant reactions and great resistance in Venezuela, so it behooves them to adhere to the rule of law and to seek incremental change and to progress in that fashion while they also seek the release of Leopoldo as a symbolic event. We'll see. In terms of, the issue of corruption in general in Latin America, I think that it is an issue of governability. How to sort of juxtapose the question of economic optimism and opportunity for business alongside the kinds of political problems that we have all highlighted. I think Susan is absolutely right. You don't need good governance to make money. Indeed, it may actually provide opportunities for at least some sectors to make a lot more money through corruption. But it means that over time, that governability declines, the legitimacy of the state declines, the state capabilities, to govern the national territory and to enforce the rule of law are problematic, which limits both competitiveness, the development of infrastructure that is needed for a globalization in the 21st century, and to gain the adherence, of the public. In that context, decline of political party affiliation makes governance or governability even more problematic and opens up the system to wide swings from the populist left to the sort of extreme, right of the political spectrum, and leads to even greater disenchantment and cynicism, right, as well as interference with business and investment possibilities. In Venezuela, I have not, I hope I'm wrong, but I think that there is an attitude within the military that suggests that we either all hang together or we will hang separately. The Air Force is probably the most professional and the most dissident. The Army is completely immersed in drug trafficking, along with the Guardia Nacional. I have recently been in Venezuela and in the Guajira Peninsula in Colombia, and there's now an open rivalry between the Cartel de los Soles, which is run by Diosdado, and the military and the Guardia, and the police, who don't think that they're getting enough of a fair share and have started their own cartel, the Cartel de la Guajira. They have, in fact, confronted each other, right? In violence. That may be one of the reasons that Maduro, before the election, shut down the border between Colombia. He was also looking for external enemies. I say this because I do not discard the possibility that when push comes to shove, that Chavismo in general, that the military that supports Chavismo, especially Diosdado, and other elements, including Maduro, may well be interested in an autogolpe, an own goal, a kind of military instability that could produce a truncation of this opening process, especially if the opposition, right, has a kind of overweening arrogance and attempts to move too quickly to undermine both social programs and Maduro in power.
Ed.
Yeah, just so that I don't pile up again. But I think it's really very, very important to understand that Maduro has very significant problems with the Chavez legacy.
Yeah.
He has been a terrible Chavista from the perspective of the Chavistas.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
probably his main opposition really has been internal, with people wanting to oust him, pushing him even in directions that are, close Congress down, forget about this, and just, just do what our natural instincts tell us to push forth 21st century socialism. So I think we cannot forget that, and we just have to go back to some studies which have shown us very, very late that the biggest fear that people had in terms of the death of Chavez was the emergence of groups that were more Chavistas than Chavez, right? That group is still there. Those groups are still there because it's not like it's a unified sector. There are numerous groups there that think that Maduro has been an inefficient Chavista and who are furious right now. And they're the ones that are, in fact, and Maduro yesterday in one of his speeches said, listen, we may have lost, but we still have 40% plus the executive, right? That has a very, very deep felt sentiment. So I wouldn't be, that's a scenario as well.
Okay, let's collect 3 questions. David, and then John, and then Irene.
David Adams again, a journalist living in Key Biscayne, but not a fugitive from any legal system in Latin America. Actually, just a very quick observation. I've seen you guys doing this for more than 2 decades, almost a quarter century. And for those of you who haven't been listening to these guys for as long as I have, hats off, because you were very good back in the early days, and you're still absolutely
better.
spot on. All of you, and Ian too.
Thank you, David.
Although you haven't been at it quite as long. But Bruce, you just painted a horrific scenario.
Yeah, sure.
And I know the Venezuelan-Colombian border too, and thinking about it, it actually makes a lot of sense what you just said, scary as it is.
Yes.
Because you are here and because you have such inside knowledge on everything Colombian, where does the peace process fit into all of that? We haven't really heard a lot about it. I mean, I follow the meetings in Cuba very closely. I mean, is it the fact that we haven't been hearing a whole lot about it, and most of what we've been hearing has been pretty good, mean that it's actually on a really good track? And could that contribute to sort of disarming some of those really scary scenarios you paint on the Colombian-Venezuelan border?
Okay, the peace process, and don't forget, let's not forget that question about Lula making a sudden comeback. Can we have the mic up here, please? Right here, right behind you, John.
Just to add to the many topics already talked about, the next big election in the region is Peru. Talk about personality politics. It's like a roll call of the who's who of the last 20 years of politics in Peru. But I'd like to hear, are there any expected surprises and what might come out of those elections?
It won't be Fujimori.
I don't know.
Andy Adani over here, please, over there.
Good morning. My name is Irene Tamayo, also a Venezuelan. I'm going to add to the question that the Venezuelan table had over there. And it's in reference to the U.S. Relationship with Venezuela and interest. I don't want to add more to the discussion of the General Assembly or Maduro and Chavismo, but more into something that is a reality for the U.S. right now, which is terrorism. As we all know, Venezuela is not only a state that harbors narcotraffic or the FARCs, but they're also are well known by having deals with terrorism. And one of the main agendas of Chavez when he was alive was to closer their relationships with the Middle East. Don't you think that the terrorism, Hezbollah, ISIS, and what is going on in Venezuela, it could represent a real threat to the U.S., like it was Cuba in his days? If you look a little bit further into what's going on in Caracas, in Venezuela in general, you see, for example, coltan mining that is destroying part of Venezuela, but is used to, part of it, to promote military agendas. And we are concerned not only because of what's going on, which I agree 100% with Dr. Bagley. We have to be cautiously optimistic. I don't foresee easy, smooth transition. Actually, a coup d'etat might be the way to go to the next step, which it will be a junta patriótica and then a call up for elections. A referendum will be kind of difficult. But anyway, my point was terrorism and
Got it.
Venezuela.
Okay, great questions. And let's start with the peace process. Bruce?
Sure. I think the peace process is going well. Santos is giving a speech today about the dividendos de la paz in Colombia. The calendar seems to be on track for a signing in March and an actual agreement in June. The real problems will be implementation, right? And they'll be manifold. The problems will be manifold. Will all of the FARC actually lay down their arms? Will, there be deposits of arms and all of that? Will there be fragmentation of the FARC? How are they going to finance this? The IMF and others have estimated that it's going to cost at least $45 billion over 10 years. Where's that money going to come from? $4.5 billion a year. With the slowdown in economic growth in Colombia, although not as bad as in other parts of Latin America, it is going to be difficult, right, to raise taxes and do all of that. And clearly there is no Plan Colombia expected from the United States. So if 10% of the needed funds come from outside, Colombia is going to have to raise the rest, and I'm not sure they're in a position to do that. There are many other complications, right? The paramilitary right, security, right, for the parties. So, the post-conflict period in Colombia is going to be quite conflictual. It is not going to resolve all of the problems that exist. It's a step in the right direction, in my opinion, getting rid of the FARC. There are going to be continued problems with organized crime, particularly the group called the Urabeños, which is the subject of my own research in recent days. So, we're not promising any kind of rose garden at all, but I do think that Santos is going to push this one through, and I do think that it's going to come up probably through a referendum that is, or a plebiscite, which is up or down, right, is going to narrow the choices, and that the Colombian people in the end do want peace. So that despite Uribe's opposition and the opposition of others, it is quite likely that it will be approved. But that's going to be a major fight before we actually get to the approval and implementation stage. I'm going to leave Peru to Eduardo. The U.S.-Venezuelan relation, look, I have two sets of thoughts here. First, interdependence. don't have time to get into it, but the United States wants Venezuelan oil to continue to flow. Any disruption within Venezuela, right, has always been seen as unacceptable. So the United States, despite Chavez's multiple denunciations and, you know, his comments on smelling sulfur at the UN and all the rest of it, right, never cut relationships off with Venezuela, and they're not going to now. That's the first point. As long as there is no cutoff on the Venezuelan side. The second point is, this thing about terrorism is really quite overblown. Douglas Fair, Otto Reich, and Roger Noriega are the ones that have pushed it. There's very little evidence, right? Certainly there are relationships with Iran and with other countries, but they're all members of OPEC. It makes sense that Venezuela wants a rise in the price of petroleum, and that it would work with countries like Iran, and by the way, Nigeria and others, to raise that price. It also does not want to be isolated in the UN, so it's going to continue to work with them. But, you know, since the synagogue issues in the early 1990s, 92 and beyond, in Argentina, there is no evidence of the export of revolution through Venezuela or any other country in the region. More terrorism has come from Canada. So if you're going to worry about it, right, from 9/11 on, you have to worry more about Canada.
Careful, you've got a lot of Canadians in the room
And
here.
I love them. It's a saintly country, right? I think that the border issue, right, is an important one. This border issue, right, is one that is plagued by the corruption in Venezuela. 52% of all the cocaine that leaves Colombia goes across that border. And coming back are, you know, because of the exchange system and the constraints, right, on the distribution system, both the Cartel de los Soles and the Cartel de la Guajira have been massively involved in the contraband trade across the border. That kind of border could explode once again, right, in a variety of forms of conflict, everything from paramilitary conflict to closing down by Venezuela because of the bleeding that has taken place. Under these conditions, that could be a detonante. It could be a precipitating factor in a rapidly deteriorating situation with Maduro and a national emergency before, right, the possession takes place of the new Congress. That's something I think that should be kept in mind. Corruption in Venezuela is completely out of control. The linkages between drugs produced in Colombia, specifically cocaine, and then trafficked across Venezuela, back to Honduras, across the Caribbean, or across the Atlantic to Africa, have become a dominant force in the pervasive corruption within the institutions of Venezuela, including the military and the police. This is a concerning, right, situation, and it is not going to be easy to purge that, even with a new Congress.
Okay, Veronica's question about Lula, possibility of Lula making a sudden comeback if he's not indicted. Yeah, it's getting closer and closer to him, and the whole scandal, et cetera, Petrobras in particular, but others. So, I mean, if he manages to escape being indicted, then he might decide he can run again, because he would still be very popular. I don't know. Here's where I don't know. I don't know how Brazilians feel about him, and maybe large numbers don't care. I mean, I don't know, but because he was sort of an idol. But of course, that was linked in great measure to his being lucky, in the same way Chavez was lucky. Chavez started governing when oil was $10 a barrel. By the time he died, it was like 100. Lula was lucky too. I mean, that he made all these commitments, World Cup, this, that, and the other, throwing money around because it was the commodities boom. So there's that. I just wanted to make a comment where Bruce, although I generally agree with just about everything you said today, which is a surprise. Sometimes we disagree.
That can't go on.
Yeah, I know. But with regard to the U.S., you know, wanting or needing Venezuelan oil to flow, that may have been true before the fracking revolution. We don't need Venezuelan oil to flow anymore, and you know, we'll still buy it because it's there and it's inexpensive, relatively speaking, and it's heavy. So in that sense, it's very appropriate for our Gulf Coast refineries. But look, we can get heavy oil from Canada, and we have increased, our heavy oil from Canada. And so if the Venezuelan government still thinks it can hold over our head that they may cut off our oil, like Chavez said, you know, years back, it's not a credible threat anymore.
Yeah, I agree.
And a word about Peru, Ed.
Well, as you said, the more, I mean, really Peru is a fascinating place from the perspective of, old politicians never die, and
And Argentina was
and
like
old
that.
men, right? No, I mean, if you look at polls, Fujimori's leading, right? La hija.
Yeah, La Hija.
And so that's important. And then again, PPK is still, very much in the running. But so is Alan, right? And so, but they're really riding on top of a major discontent over the performance, not even necessarily of Humala, but of his wife, the perceptions of corruption that you're talking about. So I think, in large measure, it's still a little early, but if I were a betting man, I would probably say that, it's going to be, you're going to see a very, very close contest between PPK and Fujimori. And she's doing her utmost. She's going all over the place. She was in Colorado the other day. She's been in Washington. She's been here. She's getting a very, very, important message out there, and there's, she's already got advisors, campaign advisors lined up and everything else. So she's very serious about this, and her polling numbers look very good for her. So, but it's early. Okay. Well,
Question
I
is
mean,
what the administration would
her
look like.
administration look like. Well, look, I think, a lot of it is, her father is very old and he's in jail, and so a lot of people expect that she will, that she will pardon him. So that from the perspective of, what'll make a lot of noise. But in terms of the economy, I mean, the reality is that, that everything that has worked in Peru has largely worked because there has been systematic continuity over the last 25 years. And those were the policies launched by her father. So I wouldn't, a new Fujimori administration, I think that it would be, basically some adjustments around the edges, but not very significant. Certainly nothing, you're not going to expect anything like what happened in the neighboring countries. So, I mean, it's working very well, and Peru has numerous free trade agreements. It's involved in the Pacific Alliance. It has extraordinary relations with the United States as well. And so I think, you can expect, continuity. And with PPK, the same thing. And even with Alan, Alan has also been around. He's been to FIU a couple of times, and he's out there. So all three are campaigning intensively.
Now, I hate to do this, but we're going to turn the lights off, and feels a little bit like the end of the Tonight Show with Jon Stewart. And I would just like to say thank you for allowing me to be part of this last show. It's been a wonderful discussion. I think you'll agree, and it's been an amazing decade of conferences and events. So thank you, Susie and Susan, for allowing me to be a part of this. Now, again, wait. Like I said, the Jon Stewart Show. Remember how that ended? So, Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add my own personal note. Many of you probably know that Susan was my dissertation advisor. I participated in many of the events here at the Center for Hemispheric Policy. It's been an extraordinary privilege to work with Susan and with Susie, and I want to thank you both.
Thank you, Bruce.
Yes, and the same with me. I think somebody said this morning. I can't remember who it was, but I think it was maybe it was Price who said that when Susan arrived in Miami, the intellectual level in Miami increased tenfold. And I say that as somebody who ran the Latin American Center at FIU for 14 years, but I think this kind of a center that gave us the opportunity as academics to interact with the private sector, right? I mean, this is really important, and your departure is really going to leave an enormous vacuum. So I hope that the university really picks that up. If not, I'm going to ask your former student, Frank Mora, to pick it up over at FIU. But we are going to miss you, and thank you so much.
Actually, Susie and I are already conspiring about the next successor, right, Susie?